Welcome back to another episode of Full Spectrum Frontiers, where we break down the big picture of conflict, national security, and what it all means for you and me, your everyday American. I'm your host, Bennett Tanton, and today we're going to venture out of the atmosphere and talk about something that's not just about sci-fi or Star Wars anymore. It's real, it's happening, and it's going to shape the future. The U.S. Space Force. Now, I know what you're thinking. Space Force sounds like something out of a bad Saturday morning cartoon. But believe me when I say, this is the real deal, and it's going to have a massive impact on everything, from how we communicate to how we protect ourselves as a nation. Whether we're talking about GPS, satellite security, or just making sure no one's shooting lasers from space, yeah, that's a real concern. The Space Force is front and center. In today's episode, we're going to break down why space is the next frontier for conflict and why we need to pay attention, even if we're not out there flying around like Luke Skywalker. But we'll also keep it grounded because yes, space is exciting, but it's not all Star Wars and lightsabers. There are some real challenges here, and as always, we're going to unpack both the upsides and the downsides, all while staying optimistic, because that's what we do here at Full Spectrum Frontiers. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. If you're liking what you hear, share this episode with someone who's into space, or even someone who isn't, because trust me, they're going to want to know about this. And hey, if you've got a couple of seconds to leave a review, it helps more than you know. All right, let's launch into it. All right, let's start with the obvious question. Why does space even matter in national security? I mean, sure, the final frontier is cool and all, but do we really need to worry about what's floating up there when we've got enough problems down here on Earth? The short answer is yes, absolutely. Here's the thing. Space isn't just a backdrop for your favorite sci-fi shows anymore. It's the invisible thread that holds modern society together. Think about this. Every time you use your phone for GPS, when you stream Netflix, even when you swipe your card at the grocery store, you're relying on satellites orbiting miles above the Earth. Now, imagine what happens if those satellites aren't there anymore. Total chaos, right? We're talking about the backbone of everything from communication to transportation, and yes, military operations. This is why space has become the next big battlefield. Whoever controls space controls a huge piece of our critical infrastructure. And that's not just me being dramatic. You know who else gets this? China, Russia. These guys aren't sitting around wondering if space is important. They're already making moves. In fact, they've been busy developing counter-space capabilities. That's the polite way of saying they're coming up with ways to mess with our satellites, jam our signals, or worse, destroy them. Now let's pause for a second. It's not all doom and gloom here. Yes, there are challenges, but here's where the optimism comes in. The U.S. Space Force is stepping up to the plate. The Space Force isn't just some flashy name for a new branch of the military. These guys are tasked with protecting our assets up there, making sure that our GPS signals stay uninterrupted, our communication lines stay open, and our ability to defend ourselves remains intact. It's not just about national defense either. Think about commercial interests. Billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are out here racing to see who can set up shop in space first. We're looking at the future of mining asteroids, establishing bases on the moon, and eventually getting to Mars. That's not just a pipe dream anymore. It's a matter of who gets there first. And let's be clear, whoever dominates space is going to have a serious upper hand in both military power and economic opportunity. So, when we talk about space, we're not just talking about a new frontier for exploration. We're talking about a new domain for conflict, a place where national security, economic power, and technological innovation are all going to collide. And the Space Force is at the center of all this. But look, I get it. The idea of weaponizing space or thinking about space as a battlefield might make you a little uneasy. After all, space is supposed to be this vast, untouchable place, right? A place for peace and exploration. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for that. But we've got to be real about the threats out there. It's not just some far-off idea, it's happening now. You don't have to take my word for it. Just look at how China's already tested anti-satellite missiles, knocking out one of their own satellites just to show the world they can. But here's the upside. America isn't just going to sit back and let others take the lead. The Space Force was created to ensure we don't lose our edge, and they're already making major strides. They're not just focused on defense, but on offense too, anticipating threats before they even happen and developing the tech to respond in real time. And that's where we should all take some comfort. We're not walking into this blindly. We're moving forward with purpose. Let's take a moment to zoom out. Think back to the early days of aviation. When planes first took off, no one thought they'd become a critical part of warfare. Fast forward to today, and air superiority is a cornerstone of modern defense. The same thing is happening in space right now. We're at the beginning of what will eventually become the new normal. In the future, space dominance will be just as crucial as air, land, and sea dominance. But you know what? This isn't just a defense game. There's another part of this story that I think we can't overlook, and that's the potential for innovation. Space technology is advancing at warp speed, pun intended, and it's going to lead to some mind-blowing discoveries. Remember how the internet started as a military project and now it's, well, the internet? The same thing could happen with space tech. The Space Force isn't just guarding satellites, they're helping push the boundaries of what's possible. That means new industries, new jobs, and new opportunities right here on Earth. So yeah, space is the next battlefield, but it's also the next frontier for human achievement. And while there are risks, there's also huge potential for growth, innovation, and most importantly, security. But we've got to be ready. We can't afford to fall behind. And that's what makes the Space Force so critical moving forward, keeping us ahead of the curve, protecting what matters, and opening doors to the future. Okay, so now that we've established why space is the next big battlefield, let's talk about the cool stuff. Technology. I'm talking about the kind of tech that would make the creators of Star Trek jealous. And the best part? This stuff isn't hundreds of years away. It's happening right now, and it's what's going to keep us in the game for space dominance. We've always known that tech plays a huge role in national security, but space takes it to a whole new level. We're not just talking about launching rockets anymore. The Space Force is diving deep into developing a cutting-edge arsenal of tools and systems that are straight out of a sci-fi novel. You see, if we're going to protect our interests up there, and, more importantly, prevent others from screwing with them, we need to be ahead of the game. Let's kick it off with something that sounds simple, but trust me, it's game-changing. Satellite swarms. Yeah, swarms. Imagine hundreds of small satellites working together like a flock of birds. They're cheaper to build and launch, and because they're so small and agile, they're harder to take out. It's a bit like going from trying to shoot down a jumbo jet to trying to hit a bunch of buzzing bees with a slingshot. Good luck with that. These swarms can cover more ground, or should I say space, than one giant satellite ever could. And speaking of satellites, the Space Force is also working on some mind-blowing advancements in laser communication systems. Now, I'm not talking about lasers blowing things up. That's more of a Star Wars kind of laser. These lasers are used for communicating, and they're about to make the speed of light our best friend. Right now, most communication between satellites and Earth happens through radio waves, which, while reliable, are pretty slow in the grand scheme of things. But with lasers, we're talking about data transmission at speeds that make today's broadband internet look like dial-up from the 90s. These systems will allow satellites to talk to each other faster, which is essential when you're managing hundreds of them in real time. Whether it's sharing information for military ops or providing lightning-fast internet to your house. This tech is a game changer. But it's not just about speed and efficiency. It's about survival. Space is a hostile environment, and that's before you even factor in the threat from adversaries. This brings us to one of the Space Force's biggest priorities: autonomous defense systems for satellites. You heard that right. Satellites that can protect themselves. Imagine if your car could sense a threat and swerve to avoid an accident without you having to do anything. That's what the Space Force is working on, except in space. These systems would allow satellites to detect when they're being targeted by anti-satellite weapons or hacking attempts and take action on their own, whether that's moving out of the way, jamming the attack, or even deploying countermeasures. Let's take it a step further and talk about AI integration. Artificial intelligence is going to be a cornerstone of space defense. You can't have human operators monitoring every single satellite 24/7, especially with the number of assets we're going to have up there in the near future. That's where AI comes in. The Space Force is developing AI systems that can monitor satellite networks, detect anomalies, and take corrective actions in real time. It's like having a fleet of space guardians on constant duty, making sure everything's running smoothly without anyone having to hit a single button. And, of course, with all this AI and autonomy, we're going to need cybersecurity that's next level. Space isn't just vulnerable to physical threats like missiles or debris. It's also a prime target for hackers. Think about the chaos if someone could hack into a satellite network and shut down GPS or scramble military communications. That's why the Space Force is investing heavily in cybersecurity measures specifically designed for space. We're talking about encryption protocols that would make it nearly impossible for any outside actor to mess with our systems. All right, I know what some of you might be thinking. All this tech sounds great, but isn't it expensive? Well, yeah, space is not cheap. But here's the thing. This is an investment in the future. And just like we've seen with other military innovations, a lot of these technologies are going to trickle down to civilian life. Take the internet, for example. It started as a military project, and now it's literally how we run our lives. The same thing is going to happen with space tech. Let me throw a few more examples at you. Reusable rockets. Companies like SpaceX have already shown us how valuable that tech can be. The Space Force is working on using similar technology for military purposes. Imagine being able to launch, recover, and relaunch a satellite or spacecraft in a fraction of the time and cost it used to take. This is going to revolutionize how we operate in space, making it easier and faster to deploy assets when we need them. Another mind-blowing piece of tech on the horizon: space-based missile defense systems. I'm not talking about having astronauts up there with rocket launchers. I'm talking about systems that can detect and intercept missiles while they're still in space. Think about how much safer that makes things down here on Earth. It's not just defense. It's a proactive measure to keep potential threats from even making it into our atmosphere. Talk about futuristic. The cherry on top. Space Force is also looking into quantum communication. Now, I won't get too deep into the science, but quantum communication basically makes it impossible for anyone to intercept your message without you knowing about it. It's like sending a letter that can self-destruct if someone tries to peek inside. That level of security is going to be crucial in a world where information is power and it's all flowing through space. So yeah, when we talk about the Space Force's cutting-edge arsenal, we're not just throwing around buzzwords. This stuff is real, and it's going to shape the future of not only military operations, but everyday life. And here's the good news. America is still at the forefront of all of this. We're not just playing catch-up with other nations. We're leading the charge. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There are challenges here too. Developing these technologies takes time, money, and, let's be honest, political willpower. It's not easy to get people excited about something that feels so far removed from their everyday lives. But we've been here before. There was a time when no one thought air superiority would matter much, and look where we are now. Space is the next frontier, and the Space Force is making sure we don't get left behind. So, whether you're geeking out over laser communication or just happy to know that someone's watching our back in space, one thing's for sure, the future of space tech is here, and it's going to change everything. But we've got to stay focused, stay innovative, and keep pushing forward. Let's shift gears a little and talk about something that gets a lot of people excited: colonizing the moon and Mars. Now, if that sounds like science fiction to you, let me tell you, it's not. We're on the brink of making this a reality, and the Space Force is going to play a key role in making sure America stays ahead of the game. Because, let's face it, the idea of living on the moon isn't just for dreamers anymore. It's a strategic necessity. Let me explain why. The moon is a prime piece of real estate for a few reasons. First off, it's rich in resources. Ever hear of something called helium-3? It's an isotope that could revolutionize how we produce energy through nuclear fusion. Now, I'm not saying we'll all be flying around in nuclear-powered cars tomorrow, but in the long run, helium-3 could be a game changer for energy independence. And where do you find a ton of it? That's right, the moon. The race to extract resources like helium-3, water, and rare earth minerals from the lunar surface is already heating up, and whoever controls those resources is going to have a serious advantage, both economically and militarily. But it's not just about resources. Establishing a permanent presence on the moon also gives us a strategic foothold for deeper space exploration. Think of the moon as a launch pad to Mars. Instead of launching missions directly from Earth, which requires a ton of fuel and resources, we could launch from the moon, where the gravitational pull is weaker, making it more cost-effective and efficient. This is where the Space Force comes into play. Protecting our interests on the moon isn't just a matter of sending astronauts with flags and footprints. It's about establishing a permanent presence that ensures our assets are safe and that we stay ahead of international competitors. You've probably heard about NASA's Artemis program, which is set to land humans on the moon again. Well, guess who's going to make sure those missions are secure? That's right, the Space Force. NASA's focused on exploration, but the Space Force will be the ones ensuring that the infrastructure we build on the moon is protected from both natural threats, like asteroids, and human threats, like interference from other countries. In other words, the moon could become the first line of defense for America's space interests. And it doesn't stop there. Let's talk about Mars. Now, this isn't going to happen overnight, but colonizing Mars is on the horizon. And when it does happen, the Space Force will need to be ready. The challenges are going to be even bigger than on the moon. Mars is a whole other ballgame. It's farther away, more isolated, and its environment is even harsher. But that's not going to stop us. In fact, this is where the Space Force's role becomes critical. First, we need to establish communication systems that are reliable across millions of miles. You think your cell signal is bad now? Try maintaining a constant connection between Earth and Mars. That's going to require not just satellites, but an entire network of relay stations. And the Space Force will be responsible for making sure those systems are protected from interference and cyber attacks. Because, let's be real, if we're setting up a colony on Mars, the last thing we need is a communications blackout because someone decided to play dirty. Then, there's the matter of terraforming, making Mars more Earth-like. Now, we're still a long way off from turning the red planet into a second home. But once we start sending people there, the infrastructure we build is going to be vulnerable. Whether it's spaceports, habitats, or resource extraction facilities, we're going to need to protect them from natural threats like dust storms, but also from any nation or group that might want to sabotage our efforts. The Space Force is going to be the guardians of these outposts. We're talking about providing security, managing satellite systems, and potentially even defending against hostile actions. And make no mistake, just like on Earth, there will be competition. China has its eyes on the moon and Mars, and Russia is making its own plans. Space is the new frontier. And just like the Wild West, there are no real rules yet. That's why America has to be the one to set the standard, and the Space Force will be a big part of making sure that happens. Now, I'm not saying we should go full-blown Starship Troopers here, but we do have to be prepared. Space isn't just a playground for exploration anymore. It's going to be a battlefield for resources, technology, and survival. And if we don't take the lead, someone else will. The good news? We've got the technology, the drive, and the experience to make it happen. We just need to stay the course. And the Space Force is already making sure we don't fall behind. Now, I know there are a lot of people who wonder why we're even bothering with the moon and Mars when we've got so many problems here on Earth. And it's a fair point. But here's the deal. Space exploration, especially the kind we're talking about with the moon and Mars, isn't just about escaping Earth's problems. It's about creating new opportunities, finding new resources, and ultimately securing a future where humanity isn't limited to one planet. And let's be clear, these are long-term plans. We're not going to be colonizing Mars next week. But the Space Force is laying the groundwork today for what's going to be an incredible, historic journey. They're building the infrastructure, developing the technology, and preparing to defend our space-based assets. So when the time comes, we're ready. Think about it like this. The Space Force is our insurance policy. They're making sure that when we put boots on the moon or wheels on Mars, we're not just making a pit stop, we're building a future. One where America isn't just a player in space, but the leader. And that's something we can all get behind, right? Let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture, the international competition for space. Because here's the thing, space isn't just about America versus the universe. It's becoming a stage for international competition and, in some cases, cooperation. But make no mistake, whoever wins the race for dominance in space is going to have a major say in what happens on Earth. And right now, that race is heating up faster than a SpaceX rocket on launch day. So, who's in the game? The usual suspects, the United States, China, and Russia. But we're also seeing new players jump in, like India, Japan, and even private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin. And, of course, we've got our allies in Europe through agencies like the European Space Agency, ESA. The competition isn't just about who can plant a flag on the moon first. It's about control, control of resources, control of technology, and ultimately, control of global influence. Let's start with the big two on our radar, China and Russia. These guys aren't just sitting on the sidelines watching NASA and the Space Force make moves. China, in particular, is rapidly developing its space capabilities. They've got a highly ambitious space program that includes plans to build a lunar base by the 2030s, and they've already launched their own space station, the Tiangong. And let's not forget, they're also very interested in Mars. China has made no secret that they want to be a space superpower, and they're investing heavily in the infrastructure and technology to make it happen. But it's not just about exploration. China and Russia are both working on military space capabilities too. Remember when we talked about anti-satellite weapons? Well, China has already demonstrated the ability to knock out a satellite. And Russia? They're developing their own set of space weapons, including systems designed to jam or disable satellites. That's a big deal, because space is where a lot of the modern battlefield plays out. It's where we communicate, it's where we gather intelligence, and it's where we navigate troops and equipment. Losing control of that means losing a huge advantage on Earth. But here's where things get complicated. Space isn't like land, air, or sea. There are no clear borders, no international laws that everyone agrees on. It's still kind of the Wild West up there, which means that nations can push boundaries in ways that would never fly, pun intended, back here on Earth. And when there aren't clear rules, things can escalate fast. That's why the Space Force is so important. They're not just there to defend our interests. They're setting the tone for how space is going to be used in the future. Now, it's not all adversaries and conflict. Let's talk about our allies for a second, because international cooperation is also going to play a huge role in the future of space. Take NATO, for example. They've already recognized space as an operational domain, just like land, sea, and air. That means NATO countries are starting to think about how they can work together to protect each other's assets in space, and that's a big deal. You've got countries like the UK, France, and Germany who are all developing their own space programs, and the more we work together, the stronger we'll be. But cooperation doesn't stop there. One of the most interesting things happening right now is the collaboration between government space agencies and private companies. I mean, look at what SpaceX has done. They've completely changed the game when it comes to launching rockets. 10 years ago, the idea of reusing rockets was something straight out of science fiction. Now, thanks to Elon Musk and his team, we're making it a reality. And here's the kicker. NASA and the Space Force are working directly with companies like SpaceX to push the boundaries of what's possible in space. This public-private partnership is what's going to keep the U.S. ahead of the curve. While government agencies focus on defense and security, private companies can innovate in ways that are faster and often more efficient than traditional government programs. But there's a flip side to this too. Companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin aren't just working for the US government. They're also competing on the global stage. Other countries are looking to partner with them, and as much as we'd love for them to work exclusively with the US, that's not how business works. It's a complex web of cooperation, competition, and sometimes compromise. So, where does all this leave us? Well, the Space Force is going to have to walk a fine line between collaborating with our allies and keeping a watchful eye on our adversaries. And this is where things get tricky. How do you maintain dominance in space while also making sure that space remains a place for exploration and peaceful advancement? It's a question we're still figuring out. There are international treaties in place, like the Outer Space Treaty, which basically says that no one can claim space as their own and that it's supposed to be used for peaceful purposes. But let's be real. Those treaties were written in the 1960s, and space has changed a lot since then. And here's the kicker. There's no real enforcement mechanism in space. If a country decides to test a weapon in space or put up a satellite that can disable another country's satellite, there's no space police that can step in and say, "Hey, you can't do that." That's where the Space Force comes in. They're not just preparing for defense. They're preparing to set the standards, to lead by example, and to ensure that space doesn't turn into a chaotic, contested battleground. Now, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of unknowns. We don't know how China's going to respond as we ramp up our space capabilities. We don't know how Russia will handle the increased militarization of space. But here's what we do know. America has been a leader in space since the Apollo missions, and we're not about to give that up. The Space Force, along with NASA and our private sector partners, is making sure we stay ahead of the curve. And while there will undoubtedly be competition and even conflict, I'm optimistic that space can remain a place for both exploration and security. So, as we move forward, the key is balance. We need to work with our allies to build strong, defensive capabilities in space, while also keeping an eye on our adversaries to make sure they don't outpace us. And most importantly, we need to remember that space, like any other frontier, comes with both risks and opportunities. It's up to us and the Space Force to navigate that balance and ensure that the future of space remains secure, innovative, and hopefully peaceful. We've talked about the tech, the competition, and even the future colonies on the Moon and Mars. But let's dive into a question that's as big as the galaxy itself. Should space be weaponized? I know. It sounds like a conversation straight out of a sci-fi movie where we debate whether to unleash some space-based superweapon. But this is real, and it's a conversation that's happening at the highest levels of government and military strategy. So, let's break it down. What are the ethical implications of militarizing space? On one hand, space is, so far, one of the few places left that hasn't been totally weaponized. Sure, we've got satellites, GPS, and all that, but nobody's put a laser cannon on the moon or armed a space station with missiles yet. The idea that space should be kept as a peaceful domain, free from the conflicts we see here on Earth, is a pretty appealing one, isn't it? I mean, wouldn't it be nice if space stayed this pure, untouchable frontier where humanity could focus on exploration and discovery without the baggage of war? But here's the flip side, and it's a hard truth. Even if we don't want to militarize space, someone else will. We've already talked about China and Russia working on anti-satellite weapons. It's not like they're holding back because of some moral high ground. They see space as the next arena for conflict, and if we don't keep up, we risk falling behind. It's like the old saying, if you want peace, prepare for war. And that's exactly the mindset the Space Force is taking. Let's get real for a second. Space is already a critical part of modern warfare. Think about it. GPS systems, surveillance, communications, missile guidance, all of these rely on space. The idea of keeping space free from military influence is noble, but we've already crossed that line. Satellites are military assets, just like aircraft carriers or fighter jets. They're just not as obvious because they're thousands of miles above our heads, quietly doing their job. But make no mistake, if those satellites are attacked or disabled, it would be like knocking out a massive part of our defense infrastructure. We're talking about serious national security implications. But does that mean we should just go all in and start putting weapons in space? That's where things get a little tricky. There's a fine line between defense and escalation. If the US starts deploying weapons in space, it could trigger an arms race in orbit. It's not hard to imagine other countries following suit, and before we know it, we could be looking at a new kind of Cold War, except this time it's happening above our heads. And that's a scenario no one wants to see. Then, there's the ethical question of unintended consequences. Space, as vast as it is still a shared domain. We're not just talking about national borders anymore. If a weapon is deployed in space and something goes wrong, whether it's a malfunction or an accidental targeting of a civilian satellite, it could have catastrophic consequences for everyone, not just the country involved. Imagine the fallout if an attack on a military satellite knocked out half of the world's communication systems. We're talking about global chaos. So, the risks are real, and the stakes are incredibly high. And what about the legal side of things? Right now, we've got the Outer Space Treaty, a document signed in 1967 that says space should be used for peaceful purposes. It's kind of like the space equivalent of the Geneva Conventions. But here's the catch. It doesn't really address the modern issues we're facing with space militarization. It says you can't put weapons of mass destruction in space, but it doesn't say anything about anti-satellite missiles or cyber attacks on satellite systems. In other words, we're operating in a gray area, And in that gray area, countries like China and Russia are pushing the boundaries, seeing how far they can go before they trigger a response. So, where does the Space Force fit into all of this? Their mission is to protect our space assets and ensure that the US maintains its dominance in space. But they're also responsible for making sure that things don't spiral out of control. The goal isn't to start an arms race in space, it's to prevent one. And that's why the Space Force is so important. They're not just building an arsenal of space weapons, they're working on defensive capabilities, ensuring that if and when conflicts arise, we can protect ourselves without escalating the situation. But here's where I think we need to be careful. As much as I support the Space Force and believe in its mission, we have to remember that space is still a place of wonder and discovery. It's where humanity can push the boundaries of what's possible, where we can collaborate on massive scientific endeavors like the International Space Station. And we can't lose sight of that. Yes, we need to be prepared for conflict in space, but we also need to protect the spirit of exploration and discovery that makes space so special. So, should space be weaponized? Well, like most things, the answer isn't black and white. The reality is, we're already using space for military purposes, and we need to be ready to defend our assets up there. But we also need to be mindful of the risks, both ethical and practical. The Space Force has a tough job, walking the line between security and escalation, between defense and exploration. And I think if we play our cards right, we can do both. We can protect our interests, deter our adversaries, and at the same time, ensure that space remains a place where humanity can come together for the greater good. Because at the end of the day, space doesn't belong to any one nation. It belongs to all of us. And that's a future worth fighting for, don't you think? Well, there you have it, folks. We've covered a lot of ground today. Well, maybe not ground, more like atmosphere and beyond. From the strategic importance of space to the jaw-dropping tech innovations, and from the race to colonize the moon and Mars, all the way to the ethical debate about whether we should even be weaponizing space in the first place. The future of the Space Force is exciting, complex, and, yeah, a little bit daunting. But if there's one thing we know, it's that America's not about to sit on the sidelines while the rest of the world plays the game. We're leading the charge, pushing the boundaries, and ensuring that when it comes to space, we stay ahead of the curve. But as always, there's a balance to be struck. The Space Force isn't just about building bigger, faster, cooler tech. It's about making sure that space remains a place for exploration, innovation, and yes, security. It's a delicate dance, but one we're more than capable of pulling off. The future of space and the future of the Space Force is bright. And let's face it, this is just the beginning. Before I wrap up, I want to remind you guys to subscribe to Full Spectrum Frontiers if you haven't already. If today's episode got you thinking or taught you something new, go ahead and share it with a friend, especially that friend who's still on the fence about whether the Space Force is real, because trust me, it is. And while you're at it, drop a review. It helps the podcast grow and keeps me motivated to keep bringing you the best content I can. I'd love to hear what you think about the future of space. So don't hesitate to reach out with your thoughts. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, keep your eyes on the stars and your feet on the ground. This is Full Spectrum Frontiers, and I'm your host, Bennett Tanton. Stay sharp, stay informed, and as always, Semper Fi.
It's just you, me, and the odds. We stuck together, we two peas in a pod. You dealt a bad hand, I'm there seizing the cards. We'll never be separated till we see in the gods. We've been low together, high forever. Long as we go together, we'll die whenever. Be a light, couldn't let the darkness try you ever. Truth in my word, you I lie to never. And when the world gets a little too hard, wipe your eyes, put away your sorrow. When it's war, I'll be leading the charge, and I'll be still fighting for you tomorrow. Yeah, even with a blindfold or in different time zones, could find my way to you with my eyes closed. There's nothing between us. Go to Mars or Venus, stand in front of every one of them rocks, they slinging and beating shit.